Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain, and like its predecessor, The Legend of Korra is a show I think largely gets better as the books progress. Working off the original intention of a more open and closed miniseries prior to additional episodes being ordered proved challenging, as we discussed in my previous two Korra videos, and a lot about the ways this retroactive foundation of this much larger story is laid out, and Amon specifically speak to that. But on the other hand, there were a lot of wide open doors written in that lended themselves to a deeper dive into the adventures of this next generation Avatar. I still think, from the perspective of his philosophy, Amon would have worked better as the last antagonist and not the first. But, that having been said, the crucial idea that he represents, the idea that the identity you've been gung-ho about since age 4 can be stripped from you in seconds, that ended up being a pretty excellent way to set up the unique relationship Korra has to her primary occupation as a sort of religious leader, but specifically a religious leader inserted into a time period and setting that greatly complicates her role. But before we discuss Korra herself, along with Unalaq and the most prevalent emotional and thematic arcs of this book, let's talk about everything else. And I guess we should start with relationships because that's always a point of emphasis and subsequently contention in pretty much every season. I generally did not like the way they handled some aspects of Team Avatar's on-again, off-again flings in the Book of Air. It was a bit all over the place in terms of how the characters were portrayed and how the scenarios were framed, which worked on some levels and did not as much on others. I think Korra and Mako 6 months after the fact comes off as a lot more honest, a word you'll hear often today, because the writers were intentional about their incompatible, clashing personalities eventually wearing on each other. Their arguments aren't strictly speaking reasonable, but the pair in question aren't either, which is what works about it. Even though we never really get a chance to fully dive into it, it's clear to me that Mako is just as guarded and uncertain with his emotions as Korra is, to the point where he spent a lot of time avoiding those topics in Book 1, much to the chagrin of poor Asami, who can't really do much about it. And here we see his inability to really commit to his feelings on anything that isn't as straightforward as police work, so of course a guy like that is going to be extremely wishy-washy when it comes to being Korra's boyfriend, much to the chagrin of Korra, who would honestly snap at him regardless, to be fair. What's always fascinated me about Mako though, is that while he was always ill-equipped to handle all of that, his personal story isn't one that allows him to be absolved from his specific shortcomings. With Bolin, the Book of Balance focuses heavily on how easily he's continually manipulated and how he needed to look at the world a bit differently. Korra and Asami both have emotionally driven arcs lasting the entire series about the inborn pressures placed upon them, all the highs and lows that come from falling in and out of love, being smooth-talked and bamboozled for power, and, eventually, coming to terms with who you really are as an individual and as a current member of an important lineage. So it's not really a shock that co-creator Brian Konietzko floated around the idea of those two possibly being endgame as early as Book 1's planning stages. So much for that incoherent it-came-out-of-nowhere narrative, huh? But the point I'm making here is that Mako never quite gets that level of narrative focus. He neither wants to confront himself, nor does anyone in the story really force him to, so he keeps doing morally dubious things like lying to Korra right after having kissed Asami in a moment of weakness. But then, once this season ends, we have a few awkward laughs at his expense because of how weird he feels around the pair now, but that's basically it. He eventually reaches a point where he's okay with all of that, but it's always been a bit unclear as to what the real intention with him was, other than to tribute Iroh's late original VA and to add on to the idea of not exactly upstanding citizens saving the world, which works a lot more than it doesn't, because again, it feels a lot more honest and true to the nuanced world the Avatar showrunners created here. A world that stands upon both the mythological and practical foundations that light and dark can stem from everywhere and everyone. But speaking of being emotionally compromised, it's hard to know exactly what to make of Desna and Eska. They're clearly presented as the stoic victims of being raised by their father's fundamentalist beliefs, but we're mostly meant to laugh at the fact that Bolin then becomes Eska's slave and or boy toy, or be okay with the fact that they never really grieve once their father dies. Granted, there was only so much time you could devote to the twins, but to me, it felt like this was one of those instances where the comedic angles clashed a bit with the depth of the story. And it wouldn't feel as out of place if they were a bit more nuanced than twins who do everything together. For example, Eska's need to possess Bolin as a symptom of her father's upbringing going up against Desna's need to obey their father. That would have been a neat story beat, had they the space to include it, especially as a companion piece to their also emotionally compromised cousin. But as is, I find the more intentional dark comedy of Varrick far more engaging. The horrifyingly real implications of all things Varrick made him one of the most bizarre and fascinating parts of the show. On the surface, he's meant to be that fun, eccentric billionaire who makes great strides in advancing the world through his business practices, and that, of course, makes his wicked intentions all the more dangerous for those roped in by his charisma. A charisma both Bolin and Asami fall for, since Bolin is not smart and Asami is desperate to get future industries stable again. It's one of the many things I love about Bolin though. In a world this sneaky and this sinister, he's willing to buy into anything that sounds like a good idea at the time from seemingly genuine people. Importantly, it's the exact opposite kind of dubious that he grew up with on the streets. The showrunners know this, so they keep using him as an easily manipulated puppet for the rich and the powerful. But getting back to Varrick, his terrible mindset mixed in with a generally agreeable personality really fits with his wide pool of influences, including Howard Hughes, who was instrumental in the aviation and film industry. He was known more for his success and being a daredevil that followed his dreams than the fact that he killed a person and got away with it. In large part because the witness testimony mysteriously changed from Hughes was driving erratically and had notably been drinking, to the pedestrian just so happened to walk in front of his slowly moving car. Funny how that works. So you can tell the creators really wanted to make Varrick as authentically horrible as possible, like when he builds a prison that he eventually stays at, and then gets off scot-free despite starting a propaganda war for the sake of a shady business takeover ploy. Speaking of those wonderfully charming movers, that has clear historical backing as well. Film, newspapers, and consumable media in general have a long and storied history of supporting, and being supported by, war and military efforts, and still very much do. This stems from Varrick's other major influence in William Randolph Hearst, who famously stitched together blatantly misleading propaganda articles with the intention of jump-starting the Spanish-American War. This worked, by the by. Then you take into account how several world powers discovered the ability film had to change public opinion during world wars, and there's your subplot. And much of history's propaganda was just as janky and obtuse as the Nuktuk films, because portraying your enemies as obviously bad and portraying your agenda as obviously correct was kind of the whole point. Not a lot of room for subtlety when your film is driven by immediacy and not artistry. But we also get a cool little nod to Sally Gardner at the Gallop, or Horse in Motion, which is widely considered, if not the first film, then the most definitive leap towards the invention of motion pictures. So you get a little bit of the fun side of American film history, along with the deeply ingrained government appropriation of the medium. And the writing doesn't shy away from that either, especially since Varrick's money notably helped President Ryko obtain his power in the first place. They really went out of their way to make the Wolf of the Water Tribe as degenerate a charmer as possible, who never really has to change because he's rich. Until book 4, sort of, but we'll get there. Now let's discuss the often argued plot point that more or less confirms Aang to be a less than ideal father. It's a pretty good foundation to create inherent division among his and Katara's next of kin, and it makes plenty of sense. We'll recall that the central driving force of Aang was always trying to be the best Avatar he can be now, because refusing to be that resulted in the 100-Year War and the destruction of his home. With a little help from his friends, he stops the war, and alongside Zuko, the world begins to move forward again. But he'll always be the last airbender. That is, unless he can bring a few new ones into the world. That was his biggest dream, to see the Air Nation restored, so it really shouldn't surprise anyone that he'd place an exorbitant amount of pressure on Tenzin to pilot that change, as both a spiritual leader and as an airbender. It's also the thing I love the most about the very flawed Tenzin. His general impatience, in spite of being spiritually centered, is built from a lifetime of being told he needs to be the special one. Waterbending isn't really going anywhere, so Kaya can go find herself or whatever, and Bumi never did any bending until well after his father's death. So Tenzin very firmly, and wrongly, believed that carrying the legacy of Aang was basically his birthright. So him finally letting go of his stubbornness and allowing Jinora to fulfill her own destiny was as nice a moment for him as it was for her. And all of Aang's kids coming to realize that their hangups are a direct result of their father's even larger hangups worked equally as well. Mainly because the writing never feels the need to falsely idolize Aang, even if the world they wrote does, because he had no shortage of flaws, especially during the days of old. It's a fact a lot of people seem to forget about when, at times erroneously, discussing the shortcomings associated with either show. And with that, let's now discuss the main narrative thrust of this book. The roaring 20s world Korra and the gang find themselves in presents them with hurdles, challenges, and questions that didn't much exist 70 years ago, to the point where the biggest question can legitimately be begged. Is Korra's role as a spiritual bridge necessary anymore? Do we still need an avatar? These are questions the Legend of Korra's story arcs often revolve around, but it's never more prevalent than inside the head of Korra herself, because for the longest time, she can only ever truly define herself by her inborn duty. The Book of Spirits presents us with a less captivating, but much more cleanly written, antagonist in Unalaq, and as a seemingly forthright, also religious leader who understands spirits in ways even Tenzin doesn't, he's ideally positioned to challenge the very concept of the Avatar. In fact, he challenges the very concept of a modern world in general, one that has forsaken spiritual education to focus on flashy festivals and fried foods. And with how often the spirits have been attacking, nobody can really tell him he's wrong about that part of his argument. To say nothing of the fact that both Tenzin and Tonraq lied to Korra about the reason she was kept hidden from the world. And keeping her hidden allowed her to blindly believe in a Republic City utopia that doesn't actually exist, and is instead filled with a myriad of problems. Needless to say, mistakes were made with the way Korra was brought up into a world she ended up being woefully underprepared to inherit, by design. And because of that, Unalaq being able to manipulate an already supremely insecure teenager was made all the easier. Unalaq has been called a very one-dimensional character, and that's not necessarily inaccurate. But I think that benefits him a bit more than having whatever the so-called good version of depth would be, because religious zealots like Unalaq exist in the real world, guided by nothing more than a complete lack of cognitive dissonance and the pure belief that they are in the right. He gets his brother banished, teams up with the Red Lotus, then ditches because he's got bigger plans, and uses those around him with expert precision. The way he turned Korra against her own family, and then pretended to care about his brother's life during his trial, that was a really well-conceived story beat. And that's what I find so compelling about Unalaq. The fact that his traditional, fundamentalist beliefs allow him the avenue to think that his actions will always be the right ones. The ends will always justify the means, even if that means his own children might become fodder. Because he's fighting for a cause much bigger, much more important than himself. He's fighting for a balanced world, a better world, or so he's convinced himself. But Vaatu presents as direct a visual metaphor as you can have for those beliefs being corrupted and thrown off balance, to the point where even the order and harmony he likely once genuinely believed in has given way to the chaos of a dark avatar. Unalaq as an antagonist works very well juxtaposed against Korra's continued struggle against self. In a show about how the role of the Avatar is immediately, and continues to be, met with disillusionment, her dear old uncle ended up furthering that narrative quite a bit. Because upon forgetting about, and then learning more about, her place in the world, Korra eventually comes to some important realizations. So with that, let's talk a bit about Avatar Wan and why he's so vital to this book. The Beginnings two-parter is a series highlight for me. It finds a way to fully capture the legacy of the first ever Avatar while not shortchanging us on its implications in the now. It's a familiar, past guiding the present type of plot that DiMartino and Konetsuko always have a good handle on. Early on, in his story, Wan can rely on his wit to just barely survive while also using calculated deception to usurp power and goods. But over the course of these two episodes, he goes through a major change. After he's been chewed up and spit out by the only home he knew, his tricks just flat out don't work anymore, even with firebending as an asset. He can't rely on deceiving or overpowering those around him anymore. For the first time, he needs to approach a hurdle by genuinely humbling himself, by learning empathy for a race of creatures normal humans see as dangerous, and not for a lack of good reasons. Wan's banishment ended up being a journey of empathy and understanding, a journey that allowed him to eventually traverse the world in search of even greater wisdom. But here's what I love the most about Wan and how he ties back to Korra's story. He doesn't really understand how the world he's in works, so in wanting to put his newfound sense of moral righteousness to good use, he ends up freeing Vaatu and weakening Raava. It's perhaps as colossal a mistake as a human could ever make, and I love that he made it. Because it's only through seeking to correct his very human blunder did he eventually become a legend, and fittingly also becomes the perfect avatar for Korra to learn from, because he's an avatar characterized as being able to get away with acting rash until he learns how the real world operates, and then, after he learns some of the rules, he's got to deal with the consequences of having the power to change those same rules on a global scale. And more than anything, I like the idea that Wan's story doesn't come with a clean resolution. He died fighting to balance a world that largely remained just as unbalanced as before he became all-powerful, and it doesn't help that his old buddies became the foundation for Sozin's Fire Nation ideals either, which also speaks to the idea that given the power, they would happily be just as ruthless as any of their enemies were. My biggest takeaway from the Avatar Wan story is how honest it feels. Yep, there's that word again. The world he knew suffered from similar kinds of problems that the world has going for it now, and he really couldn't solve much of it before he died. What's more, he made questionable decisions in spite of good intentions throughout his entire life, even establishing himself as the bridge between worlds. The Avatar's most spiritual responsibility was arguably a mistake, and as we know, the show very much argues it. Unalaq states that there shouldn't be a bridge, and that spirits and humans should learn how to coexist. Putting aside the fact that he eventually discards that nugget of wisdom, he's not lacking a point. Korra learns from her healing session that even a screw-up like Wan can accomplish wonders and live up to the title she now holds. But Unalaq, he presents one of the biggest ideas about this season and every season afterwards. Korra learns more from her enemies than from her past lives. She's forced to go through this harrowing journey of near-death, memory loss, and losing her connection to her sense of self. She can't be the same kind of avatar as Aang or Roku or anyone else, and even before then she never could. She can't overly define herself by her role either, and what ends up happening is that despite her misgivings, despite her mistakes, and despite a nearly overwhelming amount of guilt from seemingly failing in every possible way as an avatar, she doesn't fail as Korra. She doesn't fail to understand the spiritual side of herself, even with her more literal depiction of spirituality severed. Like many aspects of this franchise, it takes heavily from Hindu concepts, which also apply to the way Raava and Vaatu are presented and characterized as an East Asian variation of yin and yang. Korra, in this moment, is fully embracing a version of herself that traditional teachings, or anything the White Lotus did, couldn't properly bring out. A version of her supreme innermost essence. In Hindu, this is what's called Atman, showcased literally here as Giant Korra. And I thought that moment, the build up to it, and that scene were all pretty great. Because for really the first time in her life, Korra can start to see herself as more than just the Avatar. And after all of that, she realizes that even for as flawed and maniacal as Unalaq is, some of his points are worth considering. Maybe bringing balance to both worlds doesn't mean being a bridge for it, and the key word there is maybe, because her ultimate decision was by no means the clean and clear can't miss obvious right call. Few things in this show are that simple, and in Korra fashion, said decision led to a backlash of complaints from Republic City, but also, hey, airbenders are back. It's chaos in the streets, but harmony with the elements. If the Book of Spirits teaches anything, it's that the world will always exist with both forces pulling at each other. And if Spirits answers any major question, it's confirming that the Avatar will always be needed. But the ways and means any given Avatar operates can and should be subject to reevaluation, to change, even if that means undoing old traditions to make way for new ones. All in all, I think the Book of Spirits has a lot more going for it than the consensus would tell you. It's really where the plotting and writing got a solid handle on things and were able to bring out the best elements of the story, pun intended. And all while mostly forgetting about the senseless implications Amon stirred up, to the benefit of the series. Because, not to get all bossing say on you guys, but there is no non-bender oppression in Republic City, and there never actually was. Spirits wasn't without some major flaws, but I think it gets it mostly right where it counts and speaks to a lot of the reasons I love this show as much as I do, and its central character even more so. And the next time we talk Korra, we'll discuss how the Book of Change pushed both even further. And until then, thanks for watching.